Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back after lunch. We're going to get started right away. We want to end on time, and we want you to have the benefit of what our panelists have to say today. So please take your seat, and we will get started. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your attention. May I kindly request that you take your seats, and for those coming in through the doors, if you could please kindly locate your seats so that we can start promptly with the view of finishing dead on time. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final panel session for the series of conversations. And this session will be focusing on the governance of work. Now, a lot of the conversations that we've had, whether it be yesterday or earlier on today, certainly bring to the fore the reality that if we reflect back on what has been achieved and what has emerged in the 20th century, we can confidently say that we've seen the development of a framework that has brought about social change, a framework that has brought about norms and institutions that regulate work, a framework that has even included international labor standards, labor inspection systems, workplace representation, as well as even specialist labor courts and tribunals. And yet, even though we can say that confidently, we also have to acknowledge the fact that these norms and institutions have predominantly been designed for formal, stable, and straightforward employment relationships. And there is a growing voice that is saying that these have achieved very limited effective coverage, not only in emerging and developing economies, but there is a voice that is saying that they are increasingly under pressure even in the developed world. And so it was with this backdrop and this context in mind that this particular panel will focus on two fundamental questions. The first question being, how can societies respond to the erosion of the established framework of social dialogue, norms, and institutions for regulating work? So a responsive question. And the second question is whether we need new or different governance structures to regulate work effectively. So again, an opportunity for us to begin to really think about the future and what will be required from a governance point of view in the future in light of what we think the future will look like. The session will work very much like all the sessions that you've seen here today. I'm going to very shortly introduce my panelists that are here. I'm again inviting you to contribute to the conversation through the Slido platform that we are using. It's www.slido.com. ILOFOW is the passcode that gets you in. You're able to put in your questions. You're able to vote for questions that resonate with you, and that allows us to bring in the conversation and bring in those questions into the conversation. We are cognizant of the fact that we have an audience outside of this particular venue, and they will be using the social media platform. The hashtag there is the same, ILOFOW, for Twitter, and we're going to be bringing in those voices from the social media sphere as well. Before we continue, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to encourage you to use your headphones, even if you are consuming this conversation in English. It does lead to better audibility, especially if you're sitting at the back, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing as well. There we go. Thank you very much. Now, with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to get straight into introducing our panel of experts and our respondents that are here for the final session. I'll start off with directly on my right-hand side, Richard Hyman. He's a Professor Emeritus of Industrial Relations at the London School of Economics. He's also the editor of the European Journal of Industrial Relations. Thank you, Richard, for being here. And right next to Richard is Geneva Bair. She is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia. Thank you for being here. And representing the voice of the workers here this afternoon, we're joined by Mr. Luc Cortebeeck. He is a workers' chair of the governing body and president of the workers' group of the ILO. Thank you very much for being here. And on my left-hand side, I'm joined by Roberto Pires. He's a researcher at the Institute for Applied Economic Research in Brazil. Thank you for being here, Roberto. And next to Roberto, we're joined by Kamala Sankaran. She's a professor of law at the University of Delhi, and she also is holding the position of a vice chancellor at Tamil Nadu National Law School, and she joins us on the panel, of course. And last, but certainly not least, representing the voice of the employers in the conversation this afternoon, we're joined by Roberto Suarez Santos. He's the Deputy Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers. Thank you all for being here. Richard, I'm going to throw out the first question at you, and I think it's a question that many of the panelists are going to want to weigh in on. The big question here is, will the employment relationship as we know it cease to be? And if that is the case, what is likely to emerge as a new model of contracting work and labor?
Thank you. It's working. I'm normally invited to panels like this in the role of agent provocateur, and I would do my best, and partly by answering another question first, because I think we have to see this, and we have already discovered this from previous sessions, we have to see this to some extent in historical perspective, because we have to know what happened in the past, how we got where we are now to develop scenarios for the future. And it's important, as was said in the opening sessions, there is no predetermined future for the world of work. To some extent, we all have choices. Some of us have more effective choices than others. But I want to do very briefly is make some opening remarks about markets and commodities. And I want to take the year 1944, which in this House is remembered for the Declaration of Philadelphia, which insisted that labor is not a commodity. In the same year, Karl Polanyi published his book on the Great Transformation. And he argued, among other things, that labor was a fictitious commodity, as was land and money, because none of these were primarily produced in order to be marketized. And indeed, Polanyi said, if they became real commodities, society, and I use his words, would be demolished. And against the background of that, I want to say very crudely we could identify three phases. The first starting with the rapid expansion of industrialization in some countries, not all, in the 19th century, a large move towards the commoditization of labor, or as some would put it, labor power. What we then saw in the 20th century in particular was a shift towards the regulation of this commodity status. Not, as the Declaration of Philadelphia put it, eliminating labor as a commodity, but constructing rules which restricted the impact of market forces on the status of labour. What we have seen more recently is in many ways a deregulation of this commodity status so that market forces are much more determinant in the past and institutions of regulation are much less effective. And I think we have to understand your question against this background. Labour, also land, has been increasingly commoditized. Money as a fictitious commodity. The varieties of financial instruments which are now bought and sold on the market and in many ways are the most productive source of profit, if not of contribution to society, has expanded exponentially in the last couple of decades. And in this context, there was a reference yesterday to market failure. When economists talk about market failure, they're referring to something very limited and specific. What it seems to me is today, market failure has become systemic. And the key challenge for the employment relationship or the work relationship is how to reduce the impact of marketization and to ask the question, and later on I will have some suggestions for how to answer it, to ask the question, do we need new mechanisms, or perhaps do we need to rediscover old mechanisms for linking work, consumption, and social welfare? And it seems to me that all that we've been discussing in these last 2 days has to hinge around that very big question. So I'll leave it there and come back to it, I hope.
Thank you very much. And a very big question that you've put, and I am already seeing some nods and some shakes of the heads from our respondents, so I'm going to give them the opportunity to come back to it. But Roberto, the employment relationship as you see it, do you see it ceasing to exist? And if it does, what do you think is going to emerge in its place?
Well, I think, Richard just framed the question in a very interesting and large historical perspective. And that's a very useful way of approaching, the challenge of thinking about the future. Because I think we've been having very interesting discussions here since yesterday, and I think our imagination of the future has been largely captured by robots and automation, and that's certainly true. But as Richard just said, the future is going to be a combination of the past, the present, and the future. And we're going to have to use new as well as old instruments. And I think that's precisely where we have to pay a lot of attention to some new developments in the enforcement of labor regulation. And we come from a series of reforms and debates and changes in the global economy that lead us to think about national governments and national regulations as something that's less important or less effective. And I've been following a series of experiments involving labor inspection in different countries, in different developing countries, that have been showing that there's a great potential for us to revitalize precisely the old instruments that Richard mentioned to deal with the new problems. And I think labor inspection was the solution for the 20th century. It worked well when we had to enforce labor standards for standard employment relationships. And now it's been facing challenges in terms of dealing with non-standard forms of employment. And before we throw the baby out with the bathwater, we should realize that many labor inspectors around the world have been reinventing themselves. And the whole idea of the erosion of the system is certainly true. if we take a global perspective. But there are many cases, and I would certainly point out to some experiences in Latin America in which labor inspectorates have been revitalized or have been created from zero, and they've been playing an interesting role in new strategies, intelligent strategies using the wealth of information we have now. And they're practicing what we could call today some kind of regulatory acupuncture, which is they're trying to think intelligently and finding the right spots where they could exert pressure, whether in global supply chains or local industries, that could spur change in coverage to non-standard forms of employment.
So we've got a new concept on the floor, regulatory acupuncture, and I'm sure we're going to come back to that. Madame Sankaran, the employment relationship, will it cease to exist? And what we've heard so far is there might be a need to rediscover some old approaches and add those to new approaches. What's your take?
You know, I would like to focus on what's happening in Asia, particularly South Asia, to point out that the kinds of discussions we've been having last couple of days, yes, there is a change in the standard employment relationship. There is an informalization of the formal sector, and that's happening all across South Asia, for example. But that's not the only change that is happening. Vast parts of South Asia have more than 50% of the labor force, which is in self-employment, which has never ever been in formal employment. And so in that sense, to talk of an erosion, and we're talking about 250 million people there in self-employment, doesn't quite capture the picture. So I have a feeling that while there is an erosion of regulatory frameworks for those in formal employment, which may perhaps capture what's happening in many developed parts of the world, in the developing countries, there is in fact an absence of the development of any regulatory regime at all. And so we are actually going to be looking at a clean slate on which things are going to be written anew. And so the future of regulation has to address this, which I think has been outside the gaze of many of the regulatory frameworks until now. There have been interesting developments there, but I think the building of it is what is exciting and I think holds great promise.
So a very different picture in the developing markets versus what's happening in the developed world. Jennifer, again, very keen to get your views on the future of the employment relationship and what do you think will emerge to replace it if that will happen?
Yeah, I'd actually like to pick up on the Polanyian theme that Professor Hyman opened with. I mean, I think in that one of the things that's very interesting about that rich and wonderful book, The Great Transformation, is that it's a quite sobering analysis of what happens when we do try to treat labor and land and money as commodities. And Polanyi's analysis here, I think, should give us some pause, because he basically says when you try to do that, when you try to disembed something like human activity and treat it as a commodity, or you try to disembed nature and treat it as a market, society has a kind of protective, what Polanyi calls counter movement. And it can take a variety of different forms. And one form that it can take is something like the New Deal and sort of the standard employment model that we've been talking so much about. But the other form that it can take that Polanyi sort of lays out is fascism. And so it's, I think, very, at this moment, sort of ripe for analysis of where we are and the degree to which some of what we're seeing, perhaps, with regard to various kinds of populism and various kinds of political trends might be a response to the dislocations that are associated with the transformation in the world of work, but also, I would say, kind of in the social fabric more broadly. That then raises this enormous question that Richard identified: how can we think of a mix, maybe, of new and old ways to link or relink work consumption and social welfare? And that question is made all the more difficult by the fact, as we just heard, that in many parts of the world, the so-called non-standard forms of work are in fact standard, if by that we mean the most numerous. And we need to be always thinking about that as well. So that brings us then to the question of governance. And I think one way that you can think about the many different kinds of mechanisms and institutions and processes that go under that term of governance is by distinguishing between public governance and private governance. I think we saw, particularly beginning in the 90s perhaps, a real upswing in activity around, and to some degree confidence in, private governance, largely driven by the challenges posed through supply chains. And I would say that there has been more recently a reassessment of the promises and the limits of private governance, and a growing consensus that in fact private governance, things, I'm thinking here of the broad rubric of initiatives that go under sometimes the label corporate social responsibility, corporate codes of conduct. I think there's an increasing awareness that that cannot function really as a substitute for public governance. It perhaps, though, can be a complement to public governance. And so we're back to this question then about what is the right kind of combination, or what is the right role for different actors to play. And I think you're beginning to see some really interesting ways in which what started perhaps as initiatives in private governance are kind of morphing into something else. So I'm going to give two really quick examples. One is Section 1502 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which is a US law, and it has something around conflict mineral disclosure. And what that law basically does is require corporations in their filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission to report on essentially the efforts that they are taking to ensure that if they are using in their products minerals, particular so-called conflict minerals, that their supply chains are not touching down essentially in conflict areas. That is something that started largely as a kind of voluntary self-reporting initially on the part of a couple companies, but has now become, in fact, a form of law. The other, obviously, very recent development that my European colleagues would know more about is the law that was passed by the National Assembly earlier this month in France, which will now require large employers in France essentially to report on their due diligence with regard to human rights and supply chains. So we're in this really interesting moment where I think we're seeing new kind of hybrid forms of governance that are attempting to address new challenges by bringing in different combinations of social actors.
So you've moved us forward into the second question by putting on the table the hybrid model. And I'm very keen to get your views on that, Richard, and whether you think that the types of governance that are going to shape the institutions that we speak about are going to be latching onto the hybrid model, or is there, as Jennifer said, something else?
I'm always slightly suspicious of this word governance. There's an old English saying, who does what and with which and to whom. And I think that is very important, because governance is a nice soft way of saying something is happening, but we may not be quite sure what it is. And it's very good to confess puzzlement, but I think we have to try and be relatively precise. I mean, lawyers talk about hard law and soft law, and many have said quite correctly that's a false dichotomy. You can have things that look very fine on the statute book, but if no one takes any notice, it doesn't mean very much. And one of the problems in trying to assess different national employment regimes is precisely this, the law-reality gap. But on the other hand, purely soft law, who sets the rules and who actually monitors compliance? And so I'm very persuaded with the argument that there has to be an interaction between those who actually have to work with the rules and those who have a degree of autonomy, independence, and define them. And getting that mix right is a very important question.
It comes back to a question of getting the mix right, and I've seen hands both from Roberto and Madame Sankaran, so I'm going to let you come in on this governance question. So, Roberto.
I think it would be useful to bring some concrete examples to these issues of governance. So temporary work is one of the big problems when we think about non-standard forms. And in Brazil, every year, during the carnival festivities, approximately 70,000 workers are hired for 5 days. And they need to be there, otherwise the street party is not going to happen. And the laws do not create conditions for formally hiring workers and firing them after 5 days. So these workers for years, have been working informally and totally unprotected with problems of non-payment of wages, health and safety issues. And one of the solutions that came up, which I think fit into these governance approaches, was the development of a service contract, a commercial contract, just to make a link to what Fabrício was just mentioning in the previous session, that labor inspectors developed together with labor prosecutors and judges in negotiation with the firms and the association of these temporary workers, that provided them basic guarantees. So it didn't formalize, but it introduced semi-legal forms that made this temporary work more protected and of better quality within the limits of the possible.
And again, adding a dimension to that dichotomy you raised, that there's no such thing as just soft and hard law, and what we're hearing here is a semi-legal approach. Madame Sankaran, you had your hand up. Let's get your views on that.
Some of the things that were raised, and I wanted to focus more on the category of self-employed, which form a big bulk of the working populations in countries like South Asia. Now, these self-employed are, of course, not well-to-do doctors or engineers. We're talking about working poor, and that's something that I like to bring onto the table. People who work but are below the poverty line. Now, these categories of workers are increasing, and they're increasing because as the formal sector gets informalized and we see global supply chains, for example, in the garment industry, we see workers who are pushed off employment relationships and, for example, become home-based workers. And once you become a home-based worker, in the statistics, and this was alluded to in the earlier session also, they're captured as self-employed. But behind that person who works at home is a whole group of unpaid family workers who, at the present time, the regulation does not recognize. They're unpaid family contributors. Is it possible for us in a regulatory framework to include these categories of workers? Second, when we are dealing with people who are vulnerable and who, despite working, are unable to get even a working or a wage which is above the poverty line, what are the kinds of measures that we must do? The reason I think that this is a big challenge is because what we have seen thus far in the formal sector is that once you give a minimum of rights to the workers, using the framework of collective bargaining, rights will be negotiated and won between the employers and the workers. But here you're dealing with vulnerable workers who may oftentimes are outside employment. And I think the reservations that many developing countries have is how far a rights-based regime can actually protect vulnerable workers, and whether one should go to a regime of state-funded protection, tax-funded social security systems, which are outside of the traditional ways in which social security systems are funded. So I would like that kind of discussion to also be brought onto the table right here.
I'm going to take your question and I'm going to bring it right over here so that it can be addressed. Rights-based regime, the feasibility of this idea, state-funded or tax-funded, how do you respond to that?
It would be a very good thing, as someone is once supposed to have said. Clearly, there's the issue, who defines the rights and how, and to what extent do those who are most in need of such a regime have a voice in setting the rights. I think it's very important and should be part of the task of the ILO to explore how this can be done. I mean, yesterday there was quite a bit of discussion about citizens' income or citizens' dividend, which are not the same thing. And for that, there are three questions. Is it economically affordable? Is it socially just? And is it politically feasible? None of these three things are insurmountable obstacles if it's considered that this is one way of dealing with things, and in terms of reducing the weight of market forces, reducing the force of commodification, this seems to me an important element. My slight problem about rights-based regimes is that that often implies giving a lot of power to judges. About whom, not being a lawyer, I have a certain degree of skepticism. And I think anyone who lives in the European Union at the moment, and for the next 2 years at least, I'm from a country which is part of the European Union, looking at what the European Court of Justice does makes one wonder, is this the best way to handle labour rights? But I mean, with those provisos, I think that the basic idea is one which certainly deserves serious exploration.
Jennifer, I see you really scribbling away as this part of the conversation is going, and I'd like to get a sense of what's on your notepad, especially in relation to the first question that Madame Sankaran raised, which is it possible to include those who fall outside of the employment relationship, and then saying maybe it's a rights-based regime that we should consider? How do you engage with those issues?
I'm not sure that it's an either-or. I think there are probably going to be different solutions required for different situations. It goes back to a point I think that's been made multiple ways on multiple panels, which is that there is very unlikely to be a future of work, but really multiple futures. And then the question, I think, that we're grappling with is what are the best possible futures available? I think that the concept of the global supply chain, as it's known here in this house, although it's often referred to, I think, as a global value chain in other contexts, is helpful here in the sense that it's a kind of a structure that can help us see links sometimes between formal workers and informal workers, often at the bottom of global supply chains that might, in a sense, start from a top-down perspective in a multinational supermarket chain. You have at the very bottom, after multiple layers, let's say, of farmers, contract labor organizations, and pack houses, you might have informal workers. And so one of the potential pitfalls, I think, is that we could err in falling into a sort of dichotomous mode of thinking that it's all one thing or the other, when in fact we might have economic structures that are actually incorporating workers with very, very different terms and conditions of employment. It brings us back, I think, to the question that the last panel really put on the table very nicely, which is what are the possibilities out there to create essentially new forms of responsibility that are commensurate with the kind of influence and control that, that players have that may not be the direct employers of workers, but nevertheless have a significant influence over the terms and conditions of workers. And I think this is an area where we are beginning to see some really interesting experimentation and innovation, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about some of those experiments later in the panel.
I'm going to come to the audience very shortly, again, to temperature check with the question that will allow us to bring in our discussants and our respondents into the conversation. But before we do that, Roberto, I do want to give you an opportunity to weigh in. Yes.
I just wanted to bring another question that, in my view, brings relevance for our reflection about, these enforcement regimes, be it governmental, hybrid, or private. That even if we find a solution for the wage or income problem through universal basic income, or if we, find some pension system based on taxes and so on, we still have, you know, the health and safety problem, which we haven't discussed here very well. And I think, you know, working can be very dangerous. People lose their lives, they get sick, and we still need, you know, to think about not only rules, norms, but also enforcement strategies to keep work environments as safe and of places of good conditions for workers.
I think you make an exceptionally valid point around health and safety issues for those who are outside of the employment relationship. And I think we're going to pick up on that issue when we come back from this poll. I would like us to do a bit of a temperature check. The poll that I would like us to pull up is really in relation to whether governments should actually do more to regulate non-standard forms of employment. And we've got that poll. It's a simple yes, no, or undecided, and it really goes to the heart of where the conversation is right now. And straight off the bat, almost 100% of the respondents thus far saying, well, governments should do more to regulate non-standard forms of employment. And this is an important question because are we necessarily saying that the future requires more regulation? I'm going to give an opportunity to our respondents to come back. I'm going to take this as a given. I don't think we're having a jostle for first place here on this one. An overwhelming number of in the room saying yes. So Luke, I want to bring you in first. Firstly, Luke, please make sense of what you see on the screen for us, and then perhaps begin to come back and give us a sense of the ideas that you would like to endorse or push against.
I think it's normal, this choice, because at a certain moment, it has to be regulated. And there is, of course, an employment relationship. And the employment relationship will be very important. It was important, it is important, and will be important in the future. We cannot avoid this. And looking to the companies, it's very important to have their people together. To have them, to organize them, to have contact with them, to speak with them. And also looking to the individual, it's very important because he has to be part of this, of his work. He has to enjoy his work, I hope so. But at that moment anyway, he or she need to have a place. And so there is the relationship, the employment relationship will be very important in the future. And look to the question is, of course, there's a lot of erosion. That was the beginning statement. And yes, it depends where we are looking. If we are looking, for example, to some of the emerging countries, some of the BRICS, they made some progress. And if I'm looking to some developing countries, they made some progress. Not sufficient at all. But another point is look to the standards and look to labor as point of, and it's a big discussion, a very difficult discussion about trade. But you see the labor measures, not controlled and so on, not well controlled, but they are in. So you see that labor and labor rights, so the rights-based is important. And so I think that we made, not for nothing, the recommendation from informal to formal work. And we know it is a transition, and we have to discuss this transition. And I listened very carefully to the colleague of India. Of course, it is a difficult way, but I do not see another possibility than to go for the right-based. And which are they? Yes, you know the standards of the ILO, and we have to go for this. I do not see another choice, not for the companies either, because it's a question of serious and fair competitivity. And all the serious companies, they want that the others would be formalized. So I think it's important for workers, but also for companies.
It's important for workers and for companies, and we'll come back and get a response to some of that. But I want to bring you in, Roberto. Again, 83% is what we're seeing in terms of the yes vote for greater government involvement in regulating non-standard forms of employment. How does this resonate with you? And then table some of your responses.
First, I want to apologize. I was asked by some of our Latino governments to speak in Spanish. I will not do that. I will speak in English in my first question, then next question I will do it in Spanish, so that everybody knows. Yesterday, I was one of these that used for the first time this Lido, and my question was, to what extent can we talk about standard, consider standard employment a full-time open-end employment, whereas according to the ILO figures, just 29% of the worldwide occupied population enjoys this standard, which is very much in line with what our India reputed professor has said. So that's, for me, the key question, one of the key questions that we have to answer ourselves to some extent. It's not new, because informality has been there for many years. I think that the main challenge that we have is we are mixing many things, but we have to mix many things. We are talking about automation, we are talking about gig economy, sharing economy, collaborative economy, informality to some extent. We have not raised the issue of societal change because it's important, but it's closely related. We are, to some extent, we have to talk about or how to deal with demographic changes, things that are not essentially new, or migration phenomena, which are intensifying and raises a lot of challenges. And we have to mix them because the key qualitative element is that they are convergence in a very quick manner. So let me just focalize a little bit on what we are calling now as sharing economy, collaborative economy, etc. What's the main new element? The problem is, yesterday someone has said that perhaps it's so difficult to identify, in some cases, not in all cases, the employer. So that's a new thing. The second thing is that we didn't raise this point, but it's very common that these services go cross-border. Contradictory enough, this so-called gig economy, sharing economy, which is not the only change, I want to insist on that, are to some extent difficult to control. And I say contradictory because the tracking system is easier, it's digitalized, but it's not so much easy to control, which could pose issues, and I'm not denying that, on compliance and sometimes on fair competition or whatever. That's something that we'll have to see, but that's the reality. But at the same time, they offer sometimes a better service. You can rank the quality of your service quite easier. You also can, it's creating an enormous networks, which is good also. And it's also creating new incomes for many individuals. Don't forget that, and someone also has raised this point. Many individuals have additional incomes, also to deal with poverty, vulnerable situations, so we don't have to lose sight of this. But what's the problem now? Right now, who here in this room, and we have been trying to find the data, is telling us how this is evolving in terms of number of individuals that are now being channeled to this so-called sharing economy, collaborative economy. There are some figures in some countries, but we do not have a comparable data just to assess the problem before, or assess the challenge before we deal with that. So if you are asking me whether we have to have more regulation, less regulation, the first thing I need is to see at the evidence, to look at the evidence, and to do a proper analysis to find the solution. And perhaps the solution is we still have to focus on permanent contracts, or what we call flexible contracts, or we all have to look at innovative solutions, new solutions, but still we are missing that.
We're still missing that, and so in that particular poll, Roberto, you would go with undecided. You would go with the undecided camp.
If I have to swing in between three, okay, I mean, I can live with that.
Mr. Hyman, you wanted to get in, and Luke, I'll bring you in as well on this point. Please go ahead.
I wanted to nuance the question, just as I think the future of work we have to nuance. Non-standard employment, quite apart from the fact, as we've heard, that in much of the world, standard employment is not standard. The whole idea lumps together a lot of very different phenomena. Part-time employment may well have a normal permanent employment contract. Temporary work where you're there for 5 days of the carnival is not the same as being a temporary employment where the work you're doing is in effect a permanent work. Self-employment, as we heard this morning, where you are, in a sense, a traditional artisan, even if in a modern form, who prefers to work on their own account, is not the same as being pushed into what I think the Italians call collaborators, which is a nice euphemism for being totally vulnerable and immune from employment protections. So one can't have a standard way of regulating all, quote, non-standard employment. But the other point is that different national regimes are very different. In some countries, there is quite effective regulation of, quote, non-standard employment by what one might call the traditional ILO-type systems of joint regulation. And if that works well, we don't need governments to fix it. I think those are probably a minority of countries. So in most countries, one can then say for many forms of non-standard employment, yes, I would go with a yes.
So you would go with the overwhelming majority in the room, but Mr. Cortebeeck, you wanted to get into this.
Yes, I think that we have to know what we want. Are we going in the direction to be led, to be governed, to be ruled by big companies, by big world companies? Or do we know what we want? If we want to have a normal employment relationship, we have to make this choice. And of course, we have to do this with the reality. And the future of work is not in the future, it's already now. And there I hope that also, and the ILO is doing a lot of work, but I think that the research we need to have, it has to come from the ILO. There I hope that the ILO can offer us a lot of and other institutions, of course, but we need to have this. And then we can follow it up. But first, we have to know in which direction we want to go, not waiting and reacting.
Let me take a quick one because I do want to come to the floor with some questions, but Jennifer, I know that you wanted to weigh in on this as well.
I mean, I think one of the challenges with the question is that it's still a bit unclear precisely how governments can most effectively attempt to regulate in contexts where we have supply chains that transcend national borders and therefore many times multiple regulatory regimes. We don't have a lot of good data on these questions, I agree, but we do know, thanks to the World Investment Report that was done by UNCTAD in 2013, that 80% of global trade essentially is occurring through global value chains that are coordinated in some way by multinational corporations. That does not by any stretch mean that multinational corporations are employing the majority or even sometimes a significant number of workers in those value chains, but they do have a significant amount of influence over how that work is being organized. And so I think this raises the question of what are the best then mechanisms to attempt to deal with that reality, which is already very much one in the present.
Okay. And Roberto, is your response to those mechanisms?
Yes, I think, going back to the point about regulatory acupuncture, I think it connects directly with Jennifer's point. And I think, expecting that governments should do more does not necessarily that we will have more regulatory bureaucracies. But if we join this idea with the perspective of governance, it means that government actors, like labor inspectors, judges, or health and safety research institutes or inspectors. They could be brokers or bridges to other actors in crafting innovative solutions. So when we think about global supply chains, we always tend to think that the brands and the central headquarters are the nucleus of that operation. And we forget that sometimes there are suppliers which provide for many different brands. And if we press on that area, we can produce effects on multiple brands at the same time. So, I mean, it really takes some investigation of the productive processes and the articulations of the private sector, so that we can build an articulation of government and non-government actors that can produce change and sustain it over time.
And again, you get into the issue of new actors, which we'll get to in a moment. But Madame Sankaran, a quick comment, and then I'll take a question from the floor, please.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the question. Should governments do more to regulate non-standard forms of employment? I think employment and work, I wanted to react to something that Luke had just said. Yes, it's true. When you are in employment, rights-based regimes work. And what we are seeing now is within the same workspace, you have regular employees, you have people who are on project-based, people who are on temporary contracts, and there is huge social tension that is building up. And there is a need to regulate, otherwise it's going to explode in ways that the labor framework cannot control. But then there is also a large number of people who are doing work and not employment. And there, I think the need for state intervention. So if the ILO is talking of transition from informality to formality, you need to bring people into income, because people are doing self-employment, oftentimes not out of choice, but as a survival activity. And look at, for example, the experiment of the Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Instead of giving unemployment insurance, it's putting people to work, so that you read development and labor law together and try and bring some synergies there. Or another experiment where even self-employed people can contribute to social security systems, so that social security moves beyond a beverage or a Bismarck model and goes to anybody who is self-employed. And I think those are the directions where the state, it's gone off the screen, but it's state intervention not just in employment but in work. That's absolutely necessary. And it's in that context that I said that state intervention is necessary to move more people from just drudge survival activities and forms of work into employment. So it's not just creating jobs, but also creating the possibilities that they can move into employment.
So a great nuance between work versus employment. I've been promising to go to the floor, so I'm going to go to the floor and I'm going to come back to the panel. I'd like to give an opportunity to Ambassador Gert Moyle from Belgium to give him an opportunity to table his questions. And I see that the questions on Slido are also jostling this. So I want to bring in some of those voices. But Ambassador, please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam. For Roberto's comfort, I will be continuing in French. Je souhaite tout d'abord féliciter le directeur général de l'OIT d'avoir lancé ce dialogue global sur l'avenir du travail que nous voulons, et le panel pour la qualité de ses contributions. Maintenant, mon pays a été parmi les premiers, sinon le premier, à organiser un séminaire tripartite national sur l'avenir du travail. Et le directeur général et son équipe y ont activement participé. Les conclusions de ce séminaire soulignent que la gouvernance du monde du travail est absolument clé. Et pour votre information, ces conclusions se sont retrouvées dans l'accord interprofessionnel pour la période 2017-2018 en Belgique. Maintenant, qu'est-ce que ce séminaire a constaté? Il a constaté que le développement des nouvelles relations de travail va de pair avec un affaiblissement de l'identification de trois éléments. Le premier, le lieu du travail. Le deuxième, les acteurs du travail, et notamment l'employeur et le travailleur. Et troisièmement, des termes de la relation même du travail. Et alors s'ajoute là-dessus la gouvernementalité algorithmique qui renforce cette évolution d'individualisation et qui manifestement et très clairement affaiblit le collectif. Alors cette évolution vers l'individualisation nuit clairement à la gouvernance du monde du travail telle que nous la connaissons. Et alors voici les questions. Devant ce constat, il y a deux questions que nous nous posons en Belgique et que je vous relais. Et ensuite, j'ai une question à moi. La première question, c'est de savoir si aujourd'hui, dans les conditions évoquées, il serait encore concevable de mettre sur pied et d'organiser le dialogue social, la paix sociale, les garanties pour la santé et la sécurité au travail, comme nous l'avons fait jadis, il y a presque 100 ans. Et comment nos mécanismes et nos méthodes devraient-ils évoluer pour faire face aux évolutions et challenges du nouveau monde du travail? Donc ça, ce sont les questions que nous nous posons en Belgique et je serais très curieux de savoir ce que le panel en pense. Et puis j'ai une question à moi-même, si je peux. Elle est dans la prolongation des questions que je viens de vous poser, c'est de savoir s'il serait encore concevable maintenant, dans les conditions évoquées, de créer un OIT, ou une OIT, une organisation internationale du travail. Et que doit-elle faire cette organisation? Comment doit-elle s'outiller maintenant pour faire face au challenge du nouveau monde du travail? Voilà, merci beaucoup aux membres du panel, nous comptons beaucoup sur vous.
Ambassador, thank you very much. I'm actually going to give all the panelists a quick shot at the questions that you have raised. Mr. Cortebeeck, let me give you an opportunity. Your hand was up first. How would you respond to the ambassador?
Yes, good question. It's my ambassador, of course, of Belgium. So it's and he's putting a lot of very important and good questions. I think let me also, in relationship with the question, there it was about regulation and regulation made by governments. My experience is, and this is the case in Belgium, but also in Europe, in a lot of parts of the world, in the ILO, that if there is no ownership from the employers and the workers, it doesn't work. If it is about an ILO convention, standards here, or is it about the intersectoral agreement of in Belgium at this moment, it doesn't work. So regulation made by the government as such doesn't work. That's one. Second, I want to tell, from time to time it's interesting for one of the partners because they think that with this government you can win something more to go with the government and not with the social dialogue. I've seen that from both sides, from employer side and from worker side. It never works. They have to come back, and they had to come back to the social dialogue. And of course, it is also with wakes, different wakes that it works. But anyway, this is important. And then, of course, the question is, the other questions may be about the role of the ILO. We can come back on this, and the future of the ILO. But I think this is important, the ownership. And it's also about the informal workers. I can give you a lot of examples where we also in the developing world have examples where we organize them, where it's possible to organize them. And then, of course, then you have a partner to discuss.
Thank you very much for that. Mr. Suarez, I know that the ambassador started off by making it easy for you by speaking in French. Would you have any responses to some of the questions?
Yo voy a responder en español, ¿eh? Ahora ya sí. Y voy a responder en relación con el papel del diálogo social. Yo creo que esta es la casa santa del diálogo social y creo que es importante que nos refiramos a ella, ¿no? somos creyentes en el diálogo social y lo decimos con sinceridad. Y creo, además, que lo que acaba de decir el señor Cortebeeck es muy cierto. Es decir, yo hablo también por mi experiencia en mi propio país, en España. No es lo mismo un acuerdo con la apropiación de los agentes sociales, de los llamados agentes sociales, que un acuerdo donde no hay ese ownership. ¿Okay? Dicho esto, ya que estamos hablando del futuro del trabajo, resulta esencial que con cierta valentía nos planteemos determinadas cuestiones en relación al diálogo social. ¿Hasta qué punto, y lo digo con la mayor neutralidad posible, hemos estado exportando un modelo de diálogo social muy europeo? Yo creo que además en América Latina hay mucha sensibilidad también con este tema, ¿no? Y también digo, y me atrevo a decir, a riesgo de que me despidan dentro de mi organización, que nos tendremos en algún momento que plantear la cuestión de nuestra propia representatividad. ¿Por qué somos representativos como organizaciones sociales? ¿Somos representativos porque alguien, la OIT o un gobierno, nos reconoce como representativo? ¿O somos representativos porque cuando miramos detrás tenemos a nuestras empresas y a nuestros trabajadores, incluyendo las empresas del mundo informal y los trabajadores del mundo informal y los individuos? Esa sería mi respuesta. Muchas gracias.
So, I do cross fingers that you keep your job as well, so I'm with you on that one. But I do want to bring the question on social dialogue that's up on screen because it allows us to stay in this particular area. And the question comes from Norway, so I'm not really sure, so it comes from Norway, and the question says, how can we ensure that all workers and enterprises, including those not members in established organizations, are represented in social dialogue? Madame Sankaran, Roberto, I'm going to give you the first opportunity to respond to this. Please go ahead.
I think, as I understand it, social dialogue overlaps a great deal with tripartism. So both at the level of the enterprise and at the level of the government, I'd like to make two sets of comments. One, the existing trade unions, I think, are increasingly reaching out to informal workers because the nature of the formal employment is changing, and which is a good thing. If the existing representatives have union members who belong to the informal organization, informal workers, I think they have a capacity, their voice will represent all their constituent members. But if not, there must be mechanisms by which trade unions themselves have to have a method by which they capture voices which may or may not be part of their membership. We need to move in that direction, that they represent not just their membership but an entire constituency. And I think that we could develop ways and means whereby they have that capacity to represent the group rather than their membership. Number two, at the level of tripartism and in terms of dialoguing with the state, once again, I think we do need to go beyond, even if there is a single representative like the 2+1+1 model that ILO has, that representative is a representative not of membership but of the constituency. I think we must push in that direction, otherwise there is a great democratic deficit, and I think that question is referring to that.
What is the possibility of that? I do want to just take your question as it is and throw it back to Mr. Cortebeeck, the possibility of representation of groups rather than of membership. How would this look like?
In fact, unions are representing all the workers. Let's look, why is the question of representativity, and you can put the question, it's a good question, and we have to work for it. We have to, of course, we have to go more to the informal sector workers, that's true, to the unemployed people, to the people in different non-standard forms of work, and so on. That's clear. And in a lot of our situations, we are doing it. But is a government, did everyone vote for the governments you represent here? No. You made coalitions. You made different coalitions, and it's a hard work. It's difficult at this moment to make governments. I'm very respectful for it, for the politicians who have to do this with what we have in a lot of countries. And you can look to Western Europe, but look to the Americas, look to Asia, and so on. Everywhere we have the same problem. Or we are going to a big majority, but at that moment it's a populistic majority. So let's see about representativity, who is blaming who. Huh? And then about the employers. I don't have to speak for the employers, of course, or for the employers group, but maybe let me tell this. Would it be good that, and I come back to some of my wording of the beginning of this meeting, is would it be good that we would be ruled by the big companies in the world without representation? And the occasion and the possibility that a good employers organization has is, of course, to represent all the companies, the small ones, the middle ones, and the big ones. And this is important too. So, yes, there is a problem of representativity, but maybe I cannot look back to 1919. I'm too young for this. But anyway, look to the situation of the employers' organizations at that moment, to the workers' organizations at that moment, to politics at that moment. That's why they created the ILO.
On that note, Mr. Hyman, I see your finger's been up for a while. An opportunity to respond to the points being thrown out. Yes.
I think I was probably waving my pen, but let me take the opportunity. I mean, maybe to contextualize both the ambassador's question and some of Luc's comments. Belgium has 50% roughly over 50% trade union density, one of the very few countries in the world where this is the case. There are very strongly organized employers' organizations. I come from a country where neither of those is true and where nobody knows what the term social dialogue means because we have no tradition and no institutions. So again, one has to differentiate contexts. I think one of the problems and certainly one of the challenges for the ILO, if one looks at tripartism, governments in many countries have diminishing capacity to regulate work and employment effectively. And those that do still have the capacity in the main don't have the will. Trade unions, we've heard both about the challenges faced with the changes in the nature of work and the workforce. But as we've also heard, trade unions in many countries have made sustained efforts to try to cope with these changes. It is, I think, as maybe in private, most of the representatives here would say, an uneven process. Yeah. And there are still some trade union movements that live not in the 20th century, but in the 19th. Employers maybe is the particular problem. I took, not only because employers' organizations are in the main national employer association based, and how that then brings in transnational companies is a challenge for that side. But even more so, I started off by talking about commodification. Employing organizations are increasingly commodities to be bought and sold. Workers who thought they knew who was employing them, and trade unions who thought they knew who they were negotiating with, now find that the company is a private equity firm based in the Virgin Islands. And if this trend continues, the representativity of employers' organizations, I think, is a particularly problematic issue.
A problematic issue that we're going to bring straight to you.
I have to say that by now, sorry for my English, I have to say that by now, and at this moment at least, the main business and employees organization that we have, at this level, the level of representativeness has not declined in terms of figures, the figures that we are handling. But I have to recognize, first of all, the idea of constituents membership. I mean, we have been working with the idea of constituents, and that's linked to the idea of representativeness. It's not that you have all memberships, but at least you have a percentage, you know. But what I was referring to is that when we take on board different views, different perspectives of business, we also take on board the views of those that sometimes are forgotten to some extent. And now we have the gig economy and all these. And there, I mean, even if they are private equity, to some extent we have the challenge to look at who is on the other side and try to take the views. I also want to tell you that you cannot imagine the effort that business and employees organizations do to coordinate the voice of business. I empathize very much what you have said. It's not easy at all because of the tremendous differences. And now we have more and more global actors, multinational, not always big, but having a different perspective. And that's, but it's worth doing that. Right. I think it really worth, not just for the sake of this house.
I'm going to come to the audience and actually do a bit of a temperature check with the poll on this issue of social dialogue. But before I do that, I'd like to take a question from Slido, and I'd like to give Jennifer an opportunity to respond and maybe to take this question as well. We've been speaking about social dialogue from the perspective of what trade unions can do, as well as public enterprises. But Steenbroeke would like to know, what can governments do to help organize the voice of workers who are increasingly working alone, separated by geography, language, and legal status? Do you have some thoughts on that? And again, Jennifer, an opportunity for you to weigh in on your earlier comments.
Well, I think in a sense this goes back to the same question about social dialogue and about the inclusion of voices beyond those perhaps who are represented by established organizations. And I want to second in that sense very much what Professor Sankaran was saying. I think there is, on the one hand, it is clear that membership-based organizations have a legitimacy to speak on behalf of members that is unique. At the same time, I see this, quite frankly, as an existential question for tripartitism. You can't really have a tripartite system if one of the pillars of that system is so weak. One of the pillars. I mean, I actually come from a country, I got you beat, in terms both of union density being lower and the tradition of social dialogue perhaps being even less familiar. At the same time, I think that there is absolutely a need to figure out how to essentially incorporate into tripartitism a shift towards, or at least an accommodation of a constituency and not just a membership-based understanding of representation. And I think there's lots of indication that that's already happening. Professor Sankaran mentioned actually the increasing attention to self-employed workers. I think that there's already been a lot of progress made, perhaps from an earlier moment when there was a lot of concern about, let's say, for example, civil society organizations like NGOs, now increasingly being seen in many contexts as, in fact, partners and allies of the labor movement. And I want to just really quickly bring up one example because it's come up, we've heard twice, I think Roberto raised it, and then also in the ambassador's question, the question of health and safety. And I want to briefly mention, I think, one of those really interesting experiments, which is the Bangladesh Accord, the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, which was an initiative that essentially grew out of a lot of organizing, joint organizing, much of it, by trade unions and civil society organizations. After the Rana Plaza tragedy, this agreement was brokered and signed. There's now more than 2,000 brands that have signed that agreement, including some of the largest clothing brand companies in the world. 2 global trade unions are co-signatories of that agreement, along with 8 Bangladeshi trade unions. What that agreement does essentially is require all of the factories that are supplying those signatory brands to inspect their factories for fire, structural and electrical hazards, and to remediate all of the hazards that are identified. And if suppliers don't do that, they run the risk of losing the business of those clients. So this is an example where we see an agreement that has really impressive reach. It's 1,800 factories. It's a shifting number all the time, but that's about how many factories are producing clothing for these brands. They employ more than 2 million workers. And this is one innovative way where I think you have, obviously in a context where formal trade unions face a lot of challenges, really innovative attempts to create a space, essentially, to strengthen that pillar and move in the direction of a more robust social dialogue.
On that note of innovation, I do want us just to close on or wrap up on the issue of social dialogue so we can really begin to focus on the policies and what can be replicated. So I'd like to pull up the final poll that we're going to use in this session. And the question is, if we could quickly beam that up, there we go. So the question is, what would be the most effective form of support that would strengthen social dialogue in the future? Is it regulatory support? Well, there we go. Innovative methods, support from civil society, or other forms of support? Let's get a sense of where the audience is on this particular question. How do we strengthen social dialogue in the future? And there again, we are seeing quite a close call, but innovative methods shooting up to the front for about 2 seconds. And we're back to support for civil society. I'm going to give it another 5 or so seconds just to see if it does stabilize and a clear pattern begins to emerge. And I'll bring you in, Roberto, just to help us make sense of what we're seeing, and we'll go through the rest of the panel as well. Yes, Roberto as well. Yes, thank you. Okay, so I think innovative methods is creating a bit of a gap with support from civil society and regulatory support, a close second and a third. Roberto, Pires, when you look at this outcome and its innovative methods just over a third in the room, how do you make sense of the data that we're seeing?
I think if we consider, the multiple options, the message I get from it is that we have to socialize social dialogue. We have to find ways of making it more open and more inclusive. And I think the fact that innovative methods gets the winner position, it says a lot about that. I mean, we have to find ways to provide consultation, to let other people express their opinions, groups, movements, even if that's going to be consolidated under the representation of workers and employers. We can use a lot of the innovative tools that we have today to connect massive numbers of constituents that are important.
Roberto, I wanted to bring you in as well. What do you see from this data?
I agree with the ranking. I mean, if I had asked, I would have said the same. I think, well, there's also, I wouldn't say it's support from civil society. It depends on what you want to consider. I think the idea is to have the support for your own constituents at the end of the day. But the idea of having an innovative approach is not just using IT tools. Sometimes the way we deal with workers and employers is very traditional. And we could learn from all a new methodology to try to reach agreements in many areas, which could make our life easier sometimes. So there's a lot of room to maneuver to improve the way we deal, and I think that that's also a kind of our future.
Prof. Sankaran, again, I just to stay with this side of the panel, what does this mean for you?
I think it also means that the representativity of the union needs to be broadened. So, for example, you have public hearings that trade unions often organize, where they get stakeholders, etc., to speak on certain issues. I think that there is this yearning, really, that many more people should feed into what the agenda of a trade union is. And likewise, in the terms of employers, I completely agree with what Roberto said, that it's a very complex space. Locating who the employer is, the invisibility, somebody mentioned that in the previous panel, the vanishing trick of the intermediary, locating them innovatively, I think would also really help.
Mr. Cortebeeck?
Yes, the Bangladesh Accord was, of course, was an innovation. it was with brands, not with the companies itself, not with the employers itself. It was, but who could make this agreement, this accord? The global unions. So you needed the global unions to do this. And I agree. I told you yesterday that this would be the big vote about the innovation. And what's innovation? I think we have to find out a lot for the future and for all these non-standard forms of work and so on. But if I'm looking to the new kind of agreements, then I see more and more that we are going first. That's not only about membership, but also you have a lot of new methods for consultations. And I agree totally that unions have more than it was in the past, contacts with civil society other civil society organizations, with NGOs and so on. So I think this is important, but also look to the subject. We have the individualization. And if I'm looking to the agreements, in the past, they were all collective. Now there are more collective agreements with some space for individuals to negotiate within a protection, within a protective framework to negotiate their situation. Some flexibility asked by the company, but also some flexibility asked by the workers.
I want to bring your voice in here because I do see that you have a point to make, but I want to quickly go back to the questions, and I'm going to ask you to pick up on this question from Andre that's also up on screen, and it's right at the top, and it relates really strongly to what we're speaking about now. And Andre is saying innovation requires innovative policies. What new policies, institutions can we or should we be discussing? And as you respond to Andre, an opportunity again to respond to some of the points that have been made.
Fine, thank you. I was going to say, what do we mean by innovation and what kind of innovation? Yeah. I mean, on dialogue, it's good to talk, but dialogue alone is not enough. Two key questions is, first of all, who has an input to the dialogue? And that's we've been discussing, whose voice counts. But secondly, what are the outcomes? And are they worth more than the paper that they're written on? And I think if one's talking about innovations, they have to address both those questions, because if people don't feel that they are included in the dialogue, they won't see any value in it. If they don't think it results in anything better in terms of their work and their life, they will ask, what's the point? So in particular, when one says support from civil society is another of these terms. I mean, who is civil society? Civil society is not a collective actor. It's a terrain within which many different kinds of actors engage and often do so conflictually. So I think we need to specify that more and find ways of saying what are the particular needs, both substantively in terms of outcomes and procedurally in terms of involvement and participation. And we need to differentiate by different kinds of groups within society.
Right, and that in itself could be innovative in terms of how it is done. I want to come back to the issue of health and safety that raised by Roberto, also highlighted by Jennifer, but we haven't given it sufficient attention. And so the way I'm going to do that is by actually going to a question that has been raised by Andreas Schmidt. It's just lower down. If you scroll up, please, technical team, on the question. And I just, it's now moving on my screen as well, so also a bit there. So the question there is, how can we guarantee safe and healthy work in non-standard employment, for example, psychosocial aspects in the gig economy. What are your views on that, Roberto, in light of health and safety that you really wanted to discuss? And then I'll bring Jennifer in on it as well.
I think it has a great connection to the previous question because, providing that type of improvement of regulation would definitely be an innovation. And as any innovation, we don't know what it is before we do it. So I think the main ideas here is that actually what we need is a process, a framework that creates a process in which the different actors are forced to come together, to sit on the table and discuss specific problems. So my research work, I've seen many different occasions in which the identification of specific health and safety problems in different sectors, for example, auto parts supplying firms to global automakers. When the different actors, unions, firms, inspectors, judges, international NGOs come together and they have to fight a specific problem, and the case there was the productivity of the machines and the protections that you need to avoid accidents, they devise technical solutions. They end up reforming the machines in this specific cluster. So they would not have that idea before sitting on the table and checking other alternatives and seeing what worked, what didn't work. It took a process, and it took dialogue, and it took tension, and it took the application of different information and knowledge to a specific problem.
And again, emphasis on the process there. Jennifer, I do want to bring your voice in on this particular response to Andreas.
One of the things that this question makes me think about is a rather lively debate we've been having in the United States about healthcare. And we have a system where our healthcare is basically delivered through employers. Our health insurance comes through employers. And I think this really highlights this broader nexus, really, between employment and social welfare and social well-being. This is an extreme example. But for me, it really kind of crystallizes the need to think about this issue of employment in a broader context. We're seeing now some of the challenges in the US of trying to deal with the limitations of that system, and more people are not able to access healthcare or health insurance through work because of an increase, for example, in part-time work and other kinds of precarious employment. I think this question, though, is also sort of gesturing towards, with the reference to sort of the psychosocial challenges of work, this broader question of social inclusion. And again, I think that points us in the direction of thinking about employment kind of in a broader context and the whole question of social solidarity. The last point I wanted to make really quickly is just to pick up on something that Richard said in response to the question about social dialogue and the need to think about that really as a two-part question, sort of whose voice gets included in that conversation, and then second, sort of what do we do beyond talk? What is the follow-up to social dialogue? And I think it's important to mention something which I neglected to mention when I was talking about the Bangladesh Accord, which is that this is not a kind of standard sort of code of conduct situation. The Bangladesh Accord is actually a binding agreement. It's a contract, and it has binding arbitration as the dispute resolution mechanism. And I think that sort of points towards the importance of thinking about innovative solutions that have a mechanism to ensure that they deliver on what it is that they're promising.
Right, and I think just to bring in another issue here, because I'm cognizant of time, but I am seeing new and really exciting questions that are being posted up, and I'm trying to squeeze them all in. And Professor Sankaran and Mr. Cortebeeck, I'm perhaps going to give you a chance to take a bite at this one first. It's the question from Anonymous, and this question says, will we move away from the relationship between the employer and employee towards a stronger relationship between the citizen and the state? And I'm going to bring it to you first, and I'll bring it back to the side of the panel. Please go ahead.
I think it's a very, very relevant question, because given the fact that so many people are going to be in the world of work rather than the world of employment, the way in which many of our social security schemes are structured are premised on employment. And to move beyond that, to have universalization of basic health care, for example, that's one way. The other is that the state actually support promotion of livelihoods for people in unorganized sectors or in informal employment. So I have a feeling that if you take a country like India, for example, there's this report by McKinsey which says something like 20 million people are going to be pushed out from the rural areas to urban areas as we have loss of livelihoods there. How do you create so many jobs? They are going to go into survival activities. And that's the reason I go back to the point that I said right at the beginning, but perhaps in a little more logical way I can present it here, that in those countries where there is a lot of people who are self-employed or in survival activities, there requires to be a greater engagement between the citizen and the state. And the routing of healthcare benefits, safety benefits, which need to be done directly between the citizen and the state, there is a need for it now, and there cannot be a withdrawal of the state from those areas.
Cannot be a withdrawal of the state. Mr. Cortebeeck, your views on that?
Yes, not withdrawal of the state, of course. The state has a responsibility, but look to the safety and health. In reality, it's important to have the experience of the workers for this. Huh? And you have to build it up with them and with the technicians and so on, but with their experience, you build up your system. So the ownership, and I come back to this, the ownership, and you need the three. And you can find out all systems, and we can think about NGOs, and they have an interesting, some of them are interesting, also for the world of work, of course. But at the end, I think that you need a system to come to a negotiation, not dialogue as such, but to a negotiation between workers, employers, and governments. And of course, the government has to take up a lot of responsibility, but without the ownership of the two other parties, it will not work, that's for sure. So you need the three, and also with some input of other issues. And our society became more complicated because we have the climate issues. We have, of course, the product quality issues and so on. And that's why I think also if we are looking to the UN 2030 goals, I think they are integrated, and this is interesting. It's interesting for the ILO also to be part of, but also with what we know and where we have experience in. And it has to make an evolution, of course, and we have to make an evolution. Unions, employers and governments, and also the ILO, that's for sure. And therefore, that's my answer to the ambassador too. Yes, we have to rethink it, huh? But I don't think that to change it all, I think at the end we would end with nothing at all.
Nothing at all. Richard, what is your prognosis of what it would look like at the end?
Again, I don't have a crystal ball. It is certainly much easier to dismantle institutions than to build new ones in their place. So if one asks about the future of the ILO, if one was building the ILO today, it may look very different, but what we have is what has evolved, and I think we should be very careful about demolishing what we have in order to follow a bright new blueprint.
I'd like, on that note, I'd like to bring up a final tweet, and I think it links to the analysis that you've just given us, and it goes back to an earlier point, actually, that was also made by Jennifer. Jennifer Dennis' panel says, regulation cannot be the only way to tackle new work challenges. Experimentation, social dialogue, soft law. That particular statement there, how does that resonate with you as we begin to close the conversation? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need experimentation, but I also think that we need to ensure that our experiments have that there's a foundation there in terms of, as I said earlier, trying to ensure that the social partners sort of deliver on their promises in terms of the experiments that we undertake. And I think there's actually a lot of really interesting things going on when you start looking across the landscape of different industries in different countries. We found examples of sort of innovative agreements that are being forged between sometimes, unions, sometimes other forms of worker organization, direct employers, lead firms, labor brokers, in sectors as diverse as janitorial services in Israel, the auto industry in South Korea, home healthcare workers in the UK, as well as the Bangladesh Accord example, the example that Professor Weil gave earlier of the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, which is a union representing migrant farm workers. Some of the most vulnerable workers in the United States have secured collective bargaining agreements, not just with their direct employers, the farmers, but also with the food brands that the farmers are supplying. So there's actually, I think, despite all of our concerns about what the future is going to look like and our inability to predict precisely, and the conversation that we've heard a lot about robots in the last 2 days, I think there's actually quite a fair amount of reason for optimism that we have some very promising leads that we can build on going forward.
I think that's a beautiful place to actually wrap up the conversation. There's a lot of reason to have a lot of optimism based on the leads that we've already seen and that we can develop further if we're going to shape the future that we want. I'd like to thank my panelists profoundly. Please help me give them a round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, we're literally minutes from the end. I'd first likely just to give a special thanks to Richard Hyman, who has to leave immediately. But thank you very much for your time, sir. As we begin to wrap, I'd like to give the Director General an opportunity just to come up and of course, share his final thoughts as we wrap up these 2 days of conversation. And as the DG comes up, I think there are a couple of themes that come to mind that have really surfaced for me as I've sat in the chair of a moderator. One thing that is, I think, clearly underscored in the conversation today was around paying significant attention to the voices that we are saying are going to be a part of the conversations that shape the future. I think those phenomenal inputs that came from young people earlier on today, but obviously it's broader than young people. There are there are people in emerging markets, developing markets. Africa was a huge theme in the conversations and the dialogue today that calls into question the process that I think even Roberto made reference to about how do we have these conversations, who invites who to the conversation, and is there a sense of legitimacy in terms of contributing to these conversations. I think a lot of learning also came from historicizing before projecting into the future by going back and getting a greater understanding of how we came to be at the position where we are has also surfaced some interesting insights for us in terms of what do we do going forward. And finally, an observation for me was that we need to think broadly about innovation, and that innovation isn't just about technology. Innovation isn't just about information communications or robotics or automation, but innovation is also just about changing the way we do things. Innovation is about changing who we are inviting into the conversation. And so, again, I'm not attempting to give a singular outcome in terms of what has been done over the last 2 days, but merely just surfacing some of the key themes that I think have resonated and have been really strong in what we've spoken about. And finally, I think what was clear in the conversation is that although there are many challenges and complexities that come with looking into a crystal ball and trying to make sense of what does not yet exist, there are fundamental opportunities that we can already begin to tap into. There are existing innovations that we can already begin to look at and replicate and tweak so that we can move into the future that we want. It's been an absolute pleasure being here with you, and I'd like to thank you for having me as well. With that, we're going to stay on stage for just a moment. I'm going to call upon the Director General just to make his final comments and remarks and his reflections over the last 2 days. DG, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for allowing me to have these final few words. It's been a hard 2 days of productive work. It's Friday afternoon. It's sunny. It's a spring evening in Geneva, and you all want to go home. I know you do. So I'm going to make this very quick. But let me say a few things which I think are important and necessary to say as we conclude. Look, my view is that this has been really a very, very good event, a very productive event, a very exciting event. And looking at the room, you seem to agree with me, because the room is still full as we reach a conclusion. I think the meeting has been extremely valuable, very rich in the content of the issues that we've addressed and what has been said about those issues. But it's also been enjoyable and engaging in the method in which we've worked, and I think that is equally important. So the first thing I want to do, I'm not sure if it's the most important thing, but the first thing I want to do is to thank everybody who's contributed to this event. Lord Skidelsky only just left us, but I think you'll all agree that he gave this meeting a great start off when he made that presentation. Just yesterday morning, it seems a bit longer ago than that. My second set of thanks go to all of our brilliant panelists. You've got a sample of them here, sat in front of you. They and all the people who preceded them up here on the stage, I think you were brilliant, and thank you to you all. It was really good, I think, to get the contributions, of course, of our tripartite constituents, the familiar people who inhabit this building and this institution. But we benefited enormously from the inputs of academics, practitioners, of course, of young people who we heard from this morning. And that's been terrific. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all of you in the room. You've been an active presence and a permanent presence in the meeting. And thanks to the wonders of technology, that's all gone off now, Slido, which I have discovered, we've been able to make you a real active part of the meeting. It's nice, isn't it? When we talk so much about technology, this has been an event when we've been able to make technology an instrument for working better and for working more, because we made more of you work today than is habitual in this type of event. It's an example for the future. And lastly, penultimately, thanks to our wonderful moderators. Noti, thanks to you. And of course to Nina in her absence, who led off yesterday in the first of the panels in the opening session. And my last set of thanks, if you'll allow me, to my colleagues, the staff, and everybody who's helped to work very hard, the people in the corner there. The interpreters, who not only sat in their box, but actually did a bit of slidoing in between there, surreptitiously. Colleagues, one of the things we wanted to do with this meeting was to do our work a little bit differently, to, as the cliche goes, think out of the box, and you haven't disappointed us. I've got a new lexicon of ideas. Invisibilization of power and responsibility. Good thought. Coolification of labour and training. You're trying too hard, Matunzi. You're not quite as young as that. Robot graveyards and tax havens. That's a good one. Regulatory acupuncture. Here's my joke. I'm not sure I get the point. I add all of, yes, thank you. I add all of this to the notion of futurization, which I learnt in Singapore last year. So, you're adding to our stock of knowledge and smart-sounding things we can say in future meetings. I'll be using all of those ideas in future speeches. I'll attribute them in the first speech, and then I won't after that. I'll say it was me. At the same time, we've called on some more familiar names to help us in our work. We started with Adam Smith, John Maynard Keynes. We thought that Lord Sgelski would mention John Maynard Keynes, Gunnar Myrdal, Peter Drucker, George Bernard Shaw, and even the Bible. So we've looked large for inspiration over the last 2 days, and that's great as well. Now, slightly more seriously, and you'll treat these as very sort of quick reactive thoughts about what I've learnt, the things that I've thought about listening to all of you over the last couple of days. Well, the first thing, and I think this we can all come together around, I think there is absolutely no questioning both the enormity and complexity of the issues we've decided to take on in this Future of Work initiative, but also their importance as well. We're talking about the future of work, we're talking about the future of our societies. We are talking about the economic possibilities of our grandchildren that Keynes wrote about in 1930. And that leads me to the very obvious sort of point that we're taking on these issues not because they're easy, but because they're difficult and because they're important. And I have absolutely no doubt that we are right to take on these issues in all of their complexity. Let me say as well that the debates have been engaging, they've been fascinating. We've been throwing around ideas, we've been thinking in precisely the ways I think we hoped we would when we put this dialogue together. It's met our ambitions. But we are going to be under pressure. Everybody who continues on this journey of the Future of Work initiative to transform our thinking, our ideas, and our commitment into results, into concrete outcomes. And if there was one thing that came up on Slido that I thought we all need to take home with us, it was that message. Didn't actually get raised in the panel, but did you notice it from that young unemployed Bosnian in the internet cafe? Saying this is all very well, but what the hell does it mean to me? What difference will it make to me? And as we all go home, let's keep that sort of figure in our mind, that young Bosnian wondering if there really is a future of work for that person. And that's a thought we'll keep in our minds all the way through to 2019 as our initiative comes to its culmination. More substantive points, a lot of people have referred to, notice I think you were slightly too generous to us, we have to keep firmly in our sights the global scope of this Future of Work initiative. The ILO has 187 member states. In every region, at every state of development, in an extraordinary array of circumstances. We have to make sure that our Future of Work initiative addresses the needs and the circumstances of them all. I honestly think we have, and this is a sort of a mea culpa, we have some way to go to make sure that our initiative and our discussions do not become skewed in the direction of one particular region or another. You know, the future of work is not simply an extrapolation of where the most advanced economies of the world have got to so far. Some of us want to talk about futures of work. I'm not sure if that's a good idea or not. Secondly, I suspect, I felt it from the beginning, that we're going to have some interesting moments as our Global Commission starts its work later this year. I can't think of a better way to say this, about paradigm change. There are some of us talking about moving to an entirely new way of thinking about how we deal with work, new institutions, new categories of work, a totally different way of organizing work in our society. And there are others warning about jettisoning things which have served us well in the past. There's a lot of philosophy being written about paradigm change and the birth pains of moving from one way of thinking to another. I think we're going to come up very strongly around those issues across the board as we think about the future of work. I felt it very strongly when we were talking about universal basic income guarantees. You know, it does create a certain moral panic, if not more, amongst us. Just a reflection on what I think is going to be coming down the road in the future. There's one more point which I'm getting to. The one other point well, there are two things which I'm extremely encouraged by. One is nobody, but nobody, over the last 2 days has made any reference to the values and the objectives which have generated the genesis of this Future of Work initiative. I think all of us are conscious that we do need to come together, inspired, as were the founders of the ILO, and I quoted them in my opening comments to this dialogue. You know, we all need to be inspired by those considerations of humanity, of social justice, and of peace. These sound like rather sort of hallowed ideas. If we think about what's happening around the world, open our newspapers this morning, look at the breaking news which is just coming through. These are the things that matter. And nobody has questioned the notion that the future of work must be a future of work which promotes and responds to those values and those considerations. Because if we do not, we're going to a dark place, we're going to a dangerous place, we're going to a place that we do not wish to go to. So I think our values are sound, our values are solid, and they're shared across the board. And then, is the ILO the right place to do this? Are we fit for purpose? That discussion which we terminated with on social dialogue and tripartism, I think, was very valuable. In the report where I first put on the table, it's my first report to the ILO conference, where I first put on the table this Future of Work initiative, I slipped in one paragraph which I was strongly advised to get rid of. And it was a paragraph entitled Representative Legitimacy. It was putting on the table some of the questions you've just been wrestling with. And after I wrote that report, many people came to me and said, you said something very important here. This is the most important paragraph in your document. And when the report was debated in the conference, not one delegate made reference to it. It was like a dirty little secret that we keep in the back pocket. Now, I say this as somebody who is fundamentally convinced of the importance of tripartism and social dialogue, of its resilience, and the fact that it has to be a major part of the future of work. Does that mean it works perfectly? No. Does that mean that it doesn't have to be strengthened, improved, modified, adapted? No. But I do not see a future of work that will respond to those considerata of humanity, social justice, and peace if we don't keep this together. Sometimes this House is so jealous of its tripartite identity that we tend to close ourselves down to outside influences, and that's a mistake. And I think if there's one thing that this dialogue has shown is that social dialogue and tripartism will be strengthened by being challenged, by opening the windows, hearing people talk about it from the outside, as it were, and acting upon what they hear. I have no doubt about that. The history of the ILO is a history also of constant adaptation to changing circumstances. We've done well on that. Well, it's 1 minute past 4:30, and we're in Switzerland, so I'm going to stop. So thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much for being part of this dialogue. I think it's taken us a very important step forward on this initiative. We will pass on what you've said, feed it to the Global High-Level Commission, and so what you have said here will certainly be more than food for thought for the ongoing process. And can I encourage you, we'll find the ways to do this, to please stay on board in this initiative. Stay on board all the way through to 2019, and I'm sure we'll find another occasion to come together again and chew over what we managed to achieve together. Thank you very much.